he could wipe out the whole Egyptian race if he wanted to, wipe them off the map. But, again, God does things with purpose and with meaning. And the purpose of these 10 plagues are to show that He's in charge, that He created the world and has control over everything in the world, and that His authority is ultimate. And of course, Pharaoh being king of Egypt, I'm sure that he thought he was the most powerful man in the world, and that he had ultimate authority and ultimate power, and everybody at his disposal. But God was getting ready to show him that he was much bigger than Pharaoh, much bigger than anybody in the world through these plagues. And so that's where we pick up in the message today if we're going to look at these 10 plagues. Now, I know you can look at the outline of the bulletin and say, holy cow, there's 10 points for the sermon, we're going to be here all day. But I'm just going to focus a little bit on each plague and go through them and talk about them for a little bit, and then we won't spend much time on each of them. But the first plague that Moses did was the plague of blood. And the plague of blood was where he confronted Pharaoh down by the river, the Nile River, and he turned the river into blood. And you pick up that in Exodus chapter 7, beginning with verse 17 through 24. And this is what the Lord says, by this you will know that I am the Lord. With this staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. Sounds like the Ohio River, doesn't it, Ron? The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs, and they will turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in the vessels of wood and stone. So I find this interesting. A lot of times we just focus on him turning the Nile into blood, but he turned every body of water. Streams, canals, ponds, reservoirs, even water that was in wood and stone vessels, he turned that into blood. Every drop of water was turned into blood. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. But the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Instead, he turned and went into his palace and did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they could not drink the water of the river. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever smelled dead fish, it's not a pleasant smell. And I couldn't imagine, first of all, the smell of blood and the smell of dead fish. So you'll notice through these plagues that God is attacking everything. He's attacking their food sources. He's attacking them personally. He's attacking the air and their livelihood. And every aspect of their lives is being attacked by these plagues. And so, you may be like me and wonder, why, the plague of frogs was kind of random, or the plague of this was kind of random, or whatever. Nothing was random with God. Everything that he did was to prove a point and to fulfill his purpose. And so that's what he did with this blood. Well, obviously, if all the water is contaminated, you can't drink, you can't bathe, you can't water your animals. So, but this didn't stray Pharaoh. His heart was still hard. He wasn't swayed by this. And so Pharaoh wasn't going to be bothered by that. As it says, he just going to go on about his day. So that brings us to the next plague, and that is the plague of frogs. Anybody in here don't like frogs? I saw yesterday on TV, they found this huge frog. I don't know if anybody else saw that on the news or whatever. I mean, that frog was like that big. It was humongous. It didn't look real. It was so big. I bet them frog legs are really good. Like eating a turkey leg, you know what I mean? It was big. But 7 days passed between the first plague, the plague of blood, and then the plague of frogs. And so a week later, God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and let the people go. God is going to send a plague of frogs. And so that's exactly what he did in Exodus chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. And I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts of that. First, verses 5 through 8, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds, and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. But the magicians did the same thing by their secret arts. They also made frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go off and offer sacrifices to the Lord." And so a few verses later it says, "After Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs he had brought on Pharaoh. And the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields." Now, a couple things about this. You notice in the first plague of blood, this plague, that Pharaoh summoned his magicians and they did similar acts. Now, they weren't performing miracles like God was. They were just doing, smoke and mirrors and that sort of thing to make some of this happen. Because at this time, Pharaoh's trying to show, you're all just doing a bunch of parlor tricks. This isn't anything special. Even I've got guys that can do that sort of thing. But you notice in this one, the second plague, Pharaoh does ask Moses and Aaron to stop the frogs and he'd let them go. And we know that that didn't happen. After Moses had left the Pharaoh, can you imagine, here's another thing. God caused these plagues, but he left them to do the cleanup. You know what I mean? It wasn't like he made the frogs disappear. There's just piles of frogs everywhere. First it stinks of fish, now it stinks of dead frogs. I think I'd be like, hey, maybe we should move. Maybe we should go somewhere else. It stinks here. So Pharaoh, once he was relieved from the frogs, he would not listen and let the people go. So his word meant nothing. He was just saying that to make things stop. It says, they were piled into heaps and the land reeked of them, but when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. So once again, he wasn't, even though he asked for relief on the second plague, he changed his mind and hardened his heart after there was relief. Heaps of frogs, heaps of land. Brings me to my the third plague, and that's the plague of gnats. Gnats are annoying, aren't they? In this next plague, we see that God in the third plague sends the plague of gnats. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, stretch out your hand and strike the dust of the ground, and throughout the land of Egypt the dust will become gnats." They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came on the people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. Since the gnats were on the people and animals everywhere, the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He would not listen, just as the Lord had said. So at this third plague, this time Pharaoh's magicians couldn't replicate it. They couldn't do it. I guess they were all out of gnats. God had all the gnats. So, but the problem with gnats is, they stick all over the people or sticking all over the animals. And so Pharaoh couldn't replicate this and he couldn't do anything about that. And Pharaoh was trying to match God. And so you slowly are seeing a progress here that God is more powerful than Pharaoh. Pharaoh can't do the things God's doing. And so each plague almost, in a sense, builds on itself. The next plague is the plague of flies. Flies are a lot worse to me than gnats. Several years ago, I used to be a youth minister out in New Mexico, and I was in a county. lived in a town called Portales, which was in Roosevelt County. Roosevelt County was like the capital of dairy farms, and so in our county we had 40 dairy farms, and so flies were awful there, and it smelled, by the way. Which the dairy farmers would tell me that was the smell of money. But I said, well, if that's what money smells like, I guess I'll just go eat more. But anyway, flies were awful, because of the manure and all that sort of thing. So I don't know. It obviously wasn't as bad as what we're about to read about, but if it's that was bad enough, so I couldn't imagine this plague of flies that God performs here in Exodus. In Exodus chapter 8, verse 20 through 24, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the river and say to him, This is what the Lord says, Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials and on your people and into your houses. The houses of Egypt will be full of them, even the ground will be covered with them." And he goes on and says, "But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there. so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. This sign will occur tomorrow. And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into the houses of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by flies. And so we see a little bit different situation here. God this time warns Pharaoh before he does the plague. He warns him that these flies were going to want to take place. But he also, for the first time, says, I'm going to send flies on you, but my people that are over in Goshen, the Hebrews, they're not going to have any flies. And so that's exactly what he does. And Pharaoh tries to negotiate with Moses, telling him to worship here in Egypt instead of going away. So Pharaoh tries to do a little compromise and do a little wheeling and dealing. Now he's saying, hey, I'll let you worship, but you can't go. You've got to do it here. But that wasn't good enough. And Moses told him that wouldn't be right, and they cannot. And he was asking if they could just go a little bit in the wilderness. So we see that when Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did what Moses asked, the flies left Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Not a fly remained. But this time, also Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. So in his willing and dealing, he didn't want them to leave, but Moses said they need to leave. And Pharaoh said they could go, but just not very far. But then he went back on his word as soon as all the flies were gone. Again, Pharaoh didn't keep his word. So he starts making promises that he don't keep. He basically is lying, saying they can go just to get relief, and then he changes his mind and goes back to hardened heart. So the next plague, the fifth plague, is the plague of livestock. And so now, not only has Pharaoh been attacking the land with things, but now he's beginning to attack their food sources and their livelihood with the livestock. And you pick this up in Exodus chapter 9, the first 7 verses. It said, Then the Lord said to Moses, Go to Pharaoh and say to him, This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on the livestock of your field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, on your cattle, sheep, and goats. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. The Lord set a time and said, Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land. And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh investigated and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died, yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go. So God is taking it a step further, and it's getting more serious. He's attacking their food source. He's attacking their livelihood, but yet he did not do anything to the Israelites. Not one animal died. And so you would think at this point, we're already up to our fifth plague, you would think that Pharaoh would start getting with it and start seeing the big picture here, but yet he does not. He's still not willing to let it go. He's still being stubborn and unwilling to relent to God. And so this next plague, God decides to attack their very flesh. And that's the plague of the boils. Anybody in here ever had boils? Don't raise your hand. We don't want to know. But an attack on the flesh would be a very harmful and hurtful thing. And you know what it's like to be. I know I've never had boils, but I've had a toothache, a really bad toothache. I've had shingles. And you know how painful that can be. We've had some painful things happen in our lives. And I'm sure, if you're like me, I was like, there would be anything I would do to get relief from that pain. And so God attacks their flesh. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on people and animals throughout the land. So it didn't just affect the people, it affected their animals. So they took soot from the furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on the people and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that they had on them, that were on them and all of the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. So it was no surprise to God that Pharaoh was not going to listen to him. He knew that even though he affected everyone's skin with these boils, that he would still not relent and let the people go. And I find that interesting, that not even personal pain would cause Pharaoh to change his mind. And now I know some of you don't want to admit this, but I know some of you, when you're in pain and suffering, you're making deals with God, aren't you? Oh God, I'll never miss church again. I'll double my tithe. I'll volunteer for the nursery. I mean, we do all kinds of stuff when we're in pain, but even here, Pharaoh was not willing to give up his control. So the next plague that comes along, the seventh plague, is the plague of hail. And I've seen some pretty bad hailstorms. I'm sure some of you have. We know that hail destroys it dents your house, your roof, your car. It can be deadly. Sometimes, you're talking about the size of golf balls or bigger coming down. I mean, people get injured. I'm sure it has even killed people. And so now we have this hailstorm of godly proportions that comes in. Moses once again goes to Pharaoh and confronts him, and God tells Pharaoh that he doesn't send a plague to wipe him out if he wanted to, but that he didn't so he could show his power to all the earth and how powerful he was. And so he's teaching Pharaoh a very valuable lesson for this. But look at in verse 18 of chapter 9. It says, "Therefore, at this time tomorrow, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt from the day it was founded till now. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die." And so we see in this account here that God is not only going to send this plague, but he's telling them, he's even warning them, hey, you need to get your animals, everybody needs to go inside because this hail is going to be deadly. Even Pharaoh's officials that he had been talking to for counsel, they feared this word and brought their animals and their slaves and everybody in. But some of the people ignored those warnings and ended up paying the price. Skip ahead to verse 24. It says, "Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree. The only place it did not hail was on the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were." And so we see that God brought down this hail, and the people that ignored the warnings suffered the consequences. Not only did it destroy livestock and property, we see that it tore up the fields and tore up the trees, and so it did a lot of damage. I don't know if anybody in here has ever grown corn, but in past I've grown some corn and I had a bad storm come through, and if you didn't grow it, you've probably seen it grow my fields. All the corn's been over from the storm. I've had to go out there when I've had corn, and I've had to go up there and put it back up and tie it up so it would stay up. So that was just with a heavy storm of rain. That's not hail, but hail does some very harsh damage. And I'm talking about destroying your livelihood, destroying what you're saving up to eat that winter and all those sort of things. So it did quite a bit of damage. Pharaoh then called for Moses and Aaron once again, and he claimed that he was wrong and that they needed to pray for him and for the Lord to stop the storm. And if they did, he would let the people go finally. So we see what happened in the next few verses. It says, "Then Moses left Pharaoh and went out of the city. He spread out his hands toward the Lord. The thunder and hail stopped, and the rain no longer poured down on the land. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts, so Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses." So once again, we see a little bit of contrition from Pharaoh. Pharaoh this time is like, hey, I've sinned, pray for it to stop, and I'll let the people go. So you would think, reading that, he's finally starting to get the picture. But once again, when it stopped, he goes back to his stance of, I'm not letting the people go. And so that brings us to the next plague, and that's the plague of locusts. If you know anything about locusts, locusts are destroyers. They eat everything. And we've had to deal with those in our lives before. I can't remember. Does locusts come around like every 17 years or something like that? Anybody know? Oh, cicadas. Well, I know when locusts do come, when they do come out, they do a lot of damage. And so we're seeing this thing coming up here where they're doing a lot of damage. And we're going to see about that here in these next verses. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, say. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will bring locusts into your country tomorrow. I can't keep my papers up here today. Then they will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen. They will devour what little you have left after the hail, including every tree that is growing in your fields. They will fill your houses and those of your officials and all the Egyptians, something neither your parents nor your ancestors have ever seen from the day they settled into the land till now. Then Moses turned and left Pharaoh. And so God again warns them, this is what's going to happen. This is what I'm going to do. And by this time, Pharaoh's officials are finally starting to get with the program, and they tell Pharaoh, how long will you allow this man to come and be a snare in our lives? Just let the people go. But Pharaoh brought Moses and Aaron back, and this time Pharaoh said they could go, but he wanted to know who would be going. And Moses said, everyone's going, young and old, sons and daughters, flocks and herds. And Pharaoh said this, Pharaoh said he'd let the people go, but only the men. Only the men can go. So he's still trying to compromise and bargain with God a little bit. I'll let you go, but it can only be the men, that's all. And see in verse 12, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over Egypt so that the locusts swarm over the land and devour everything growing in the fields, everything left by the hail. So Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all the day and all the night. By morning the wind had brought the locusts. They invaded all of Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered all the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit of the trees. Nothing green remained on the tree or plant in the land of Egypt. So basically what the hail didn't destroy, the locusts came and destroyed everything. So there was nothing left. There was no trees left, there were no plants left, there was no vegetation left, everything was gone. And so these plagues are getting more and more severe and causing more and more destruction and uncomfortableness to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And so this plan that Pharaoh has is not working out. So he summons Moses and Aaron again and gives them the same line about sinning and asking for forgiveness, and he wants them to pray for the Lord to take the plague away. And so verse 18, it says, Moses then left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord changed the wind to a very strong west wind, which caught up the locusts and carried them into the Red Sea. Not a locust was left anywhere in Egypt, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. I mean, it's just amazing that after the locusts were gone, Pharaoh again went back on his word and wouldn't let the people go. At this point, I mean, he's out of a lot of options. The livestock are gone, the land is gone. I mean, just all of these different things have happened, and he still has a hard heart. So the next one is the plague of darkness. And God sends darkness on the land. And you first read that and think, well, that doesn't really seem like that big a deal. But I've read this before. I've heard if you stay in darkness too long with no light, you eventually go blind. Has anybody else ever heard that? I also have heard it can drive you insane. That ain't a very far drive for me. But anyway, I don't know about you all. But so this ninth plague turned out to be turned the lights out on Pharaoh and his people. If you look at these next several verses in chapter 10, it's at the beginning of verse 21, it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand towards the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt. Darkness that can be felt. You ever felt darkness? That's pretty dark. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days, yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and said, Go worship the Lord, even your women and children may go with you, only leave your flocks and herds behind. So he's still trying to wheel and deal, he's still trying to get something out of it. Now he's saying, no, you can let your women and children go, but you still got to leave your flocks and herds behind. But Moses said, You must allow us to have sacrifices and burnt offerings to present to the Lord. Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. We have to use some of them in worshiping the Lord our God, and until we get there, we will not know what we are to use to worship the Lord. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. Pharaoh said to Moses, Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die. Just as you say, Moses replied, I will never appear before you again. So I would say at this point things are getting pretty serious. Pharaoh summoned Moses and told him, get out of here, I don't want to see you again. The next time I see you, you're going to die. And so Moses agrees and says, you'll never see me again, which is not true, he does see him again. But it brings us to the final plague and the most serious one. So at this point, he's attacked everything. He's attacked the land, he's attacked the water sources, he's attacked the people, he's attacked their animals, the food sources, the land, destroyed everything. I mean, everything you can think of has been affected and destroyed by all of these plagues. So what's left? 9 plagues, and Pharaoh still won't let the people go. And so the 10th and final plague is one that breaks Pharaoh and will allow the Israelites to be set free. And that was the plague of the firstborn. God attacked Pharaoh and the people where it hurt most. He took their firstborn child. And again, a firstborn child could have already been an adult. This isn't just babies. He's not just killing babies. He's killing whatever the firstborn male of every family in Egypt. Now the Lord said to Moses, verse 1, chapter 11, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here, and when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people. So Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. So he's not just killing the firstborn sons, he's killing all the firstborn cattle. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there's ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Would that not be nice? Why dogs bark all the time? Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, go, you and all your people who follow you. After that I will leave. Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh. The Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will refuse to listen to you so that my wonders may be multiplied in Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go out of this country. And so now God gives Moses some instructions for his people, what they need to do, and then he is about to lay on the final plague to Pharaoh, and after this, Pharaoh will let the people go. And so he's going to kill all these Egyptians, or all these Egyptian firstborn, including animals, and then they will let the people go. But what I think is interesting about this story is not only will they let the people go, but they're going to give them a bunch of party gifts. Ask them for silver and gold and these things, and they're like, you know how it is, I just want to get rid of you. So take what you want, we just want you to go. And so that's exactly what they did. And we'll get into more of this final plague next week. In my message, when we're talking about the Passover, we'll get into more details about how God handles this 10th plague and what the people do, and so I'll get to that more next week. But as we get to wrap this message up this morning, I want us to understand that these plagues and all these wonders that God used were to show His power, to show the power of His name, and to show the power of His hand, and not only to Pharaoh but to the world. God showed distinction between His people and the Egyptians. He showed Pharaoh that he has control over everything. He has control over water. He has control over animals. He even has control over you and what happens to you. He has control over night and day. He has control over the fields and the trees and everything. Everything in all creation is God's. He created it. He can do what He wants with it. God is more powerful than Pharaoh. Pharaoh thought he was in charge, but he wasn't. Pharaoh thought he was the most powerful man in the world, but it proves that he wasn't. Because Pharaoh could not do the things that God has done. And all of these was to show that he was indeed who He said he was. And I believe God works that way today, in a sense. I don't think God's going to send plagues on your life if you disobey Him or don't follow His will, or you purposely or habitually sin. But I do think God does things in our life to give us a wake-up call. I think God does things in our life to give us an opportunity to do the right thing, to repent, to follow Him. Not only does He do it for people who want to give their life to Christ and be baptized, I think God sometimes works in people's lives to get them to the point where they realize, hey, I need to surrender my will and my life to God and be saved and be baptized and be a part of His church. But I also think once you become a Christian and once you live for God, there's times along the way as we're trying to learn and grow and mature in our faith that God provides lessons and tests and opportunities for us. And we need to take advantage of those because sometimes we ignore those things. We ignore the Holy Spirit prompting us. We ignore the things that God sends in our life to try to teach us. And the thing is, I believe God will continue to try to get our attention. But I believe at some point when we continue to rebel, He'll just stop. And that's just my opinion, but I believe God's never going to beg anyone to follow Him. God's not going to beg anyone to become a Christian. God's not going to beg anyone to be a part of His church. God's not going to beg anyone to worship and serve Him. That's our choice. It's our free will. But I can't imagine learning about God and knowing about God. And I know right now when you're seeing God in the Old Testament, He seems a little harsh, doesn't He? You know, people are getting killed. He allowed Pharaoh to kill male babies, and a lot of people were affected by all these things. But we have to remember, God is in control. And God can do what He wants to do. God created this world. God created me and you. So, God can do anything He wants, and He's within that right because He is our Creator, and He's the Creator of all creation. However, we have to sometimes see the bigger picture. God did things a little bit differently in the Old Testament than He did in the New Testament. And some people even think that there's an Old Testament God and a New Testament God. They're different gods, but they're not. It's the same God. But for time periods and certain times in life, God did things a certain way. You see that here in the early part of the Old Testament. And then once the people do get free and He comes up with the law of Moses and the Ten Commandments and all that goes on, then people live under that covenant. And then later on when Jesus comes and resurrects and establishes a new covenant, and the church in Acts chapter 2, then He has another way of doing things. But never lose the fact that God is a loving God that loves His people. So yeah, He might be being a little harsh to the Pharaoh, but Pharaoh he did deserve it. And his people suffered because of his hard heart. Just like sometimes we suffer the consequences of poor choices of people in our life. Our sin and our rebellion affects other people. We need to remember that our poor decisions affect our family, our friends, our church, our loved ones. Sometimes they can affect people in major ways. When you're talking about more serious things like drinking and driving or drug addiction or people that go out and commit violent acts. And so it affects a lot of people. But God, because of Pharaoh, did punish the people. But God also showed love and compassion towards His people and led them to the promised land that we will see in the coming weeks. But I just want to encourage you this morning as you read these stories, understand that God is ultimately in control of your life. And when things seem bad or you're down or you're going through a hard time, don't forget to stay faithful to God and trust in Him, because God has a plan. God already knows the outcome, and God promises that He will deliver you just like He's going to deliver the Israelites. And so I hope that that's something we can take home from this lesson this morning. We're going to offer an invitation. We're going to do this a little bit different. I'm just going to sing one verse of a hymn.